So here we are in our ongoing conversation that we started with our first video about the coming arrival of the vaccine for COVID, and just the opportunity to spend some time with you all exploring more deeply what that means for us and what important issues that surfaces for us. You may recall that we talked last time briefly about the fact that all of us come to these complex decisions and issues in our lives really with three areas that tend to influence us. One is our life experience or our lived experience around these things. The other is just what have we heard, what have we learned, what is the sort of public narrative that plays in our lives, which could be different between us. And third is sort of the data and the science that goes into these decisions. And so I just wanted to reframe that as we really have this first substantive conversation about an important element of this particular vaccine, and that has to do with the speed with which it has been developed, which some have marveled at, others have really expressed some concerns about. And so we want to talk about that and get us thinking about that. You remember we talked about really an open dialogue is what we're looking for, and we're looking for open minds as we approach that dialogue. And so Sean, I'm going to invite you in to just talk a little bit about that issue of, boy, this thing was developed pretty quick. And what are you hearing about that? And you know, what are we thinking about?
What I've heard from people, Dave, is a concern about the speed at which this vaccine was developed and approved. And there's some skepticism there, I think, about whether it's safe, whether it's been tested long enough, or whether there were corners that were cut in order to get it out early. And maybe you can talk a little bit about what you know about how the process looked different this time, which led to it being shorter than a typical vaccine being developed.
Yeah. So, and certainly, I think I've certainly heard that concern. And you know, it's interesting. After all these years, I'm sort of putting back on my old pharmacy hat, as it were. You know, I practiced pharmacy for a number of years before I started in this work, and so because of that, doesn't make me an expert in this by any means. And so I don't want to suggest that, but it does give me a background in interpreting these things and the science behind it and the process. And so let me just talk about the research I've done about the process of this vaccine, which really has been significantly shortened in order to get this vaccine to where it is now ready to go. And really, the science is the same. The process has been really re-engineered in a way that made it very, very efficient. So one of the first things that happened with this is the federal government, way back at the beginning of this pandemic, really in March and April already, began to work with pharmaceutical companies who have the capacity to develop vaccines, and established a standard set of protocols around which the vaccine could be developed. Normally, pharmaceutical companies are sent off or do that on their own. And so with 40 different pharmaceutical companies, you could have 40 different ways of going about it. And what they did was they got all the brains together and came up with the best set of protocols that everybody agreed would be followed. That streamlined it, not just for the pharmaceutical companies, but also for the federal government who and other outside agencies who have to approve these things, because they're not looking at 40 different protocols. Now they're looking at the adherence to one protocol. So that sounds like a little thing, but normally that is months and months of development. They were able to do that because they brought all the brains together to do it together. So there was that. Typically, a vaccine is tested before it hits the market in 3 phases, and then there's a 4th phase afterwards. But the first phase is the most important. The first phase is once they have what they call a candidate, a vaccine candidate, the first phase is testing it for safety, because nothing happens if you can't get it through the safety protocols. And so the candidates went into the safety phase 1 testing, and that proved that several of them, a bunch of them actually, met the safety standards. And that had nothing to do with whether they were going to work. It starts with sort of do no harm. And so, so when that was done, then they were able to move into the phase 2 and phase 3, but they did it in parallel fashion, not sequential. So normally you would do phase 2, wait and collect that data, and then go into phase 3 and collect that data. Well, they scaled the testing significantly in a very short period of time and shrunk that time period, but did not shrink. In fact, they expanded the number of folks who were in the trials. The Pfizer vaccine, which is really the first to the market, it tested over 44,000 people, which typically their threshold is 30,000 for a new vaccine. So they went above that. But probably what shrunk the time period the most of all of that, which that was significant, was that as soon as a viable candidate passed the safety test phase 1 and started to show promise that it would be effective in phase 2, not even all the way through phase 2, but once it showed a promise, then the federal government provided funds to those pharmaceutical companies. There were 4 of them initially, to go ahead and start building out the capacity to actually produce the thing. And that takes a long time to build out these factories and get them ready. And pharmaceutical companies under normal circumstances would never do that until they have final approval from all the authorities, because they're taking too big a financial risk. I mean, it's $1 billion to stand up a factory or a capacity that can build the sort of doses that are needed. And so what the federal government said was, we're going to take that financial risk on because we believe you're onto something here. And if it works, then we're going to use the money we gave you to buy that product, and we'll distribute it, right? And if it doesn't work, then we, federal government, will be out that money. And so what happened was there were 4 candidates that way back earlier this year, the government invested in ahead of time so that everything was ready, and the capacity to put out large amounts of vaccine was stood up and ready to go. If one of the vaccines didn't pass all through those 3 phases, the government would have ate that loss, not the pharmaceutical companies. So those are the main things, Sean. And so I'm curious, again, that's the process. I'm curious, sort of, how does that hit you, and what thoughts does that bring up for you?
So that makes sense. I mean, understanding that the phases that normally would happen sequentially happened concurrently would certainly compress the time frame, and it doesn't sound like corners were cut as much as efficiencies were put in place that maybe we haven't followed before. I think the other thing I've heard is that, or seen, this was really a global effort to develop a vaccine. This wasn't specific countries that were most impacted by a not very widespread virus working to try to develop something. The scale of this, the impact of this was global. And so you had multiple countries running processes concurrently, trying to essentially race to get to a vaccine because everybody needed it quickly.
Yeah,
right? That seems to be something else that accelerated this process.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And in the case of the Pfizer vaccine, they actually partnered with a German company who had different capabilities that they normally wouldn't partner with. But because the first step in all of this was to get all the capable pharmaceutical companies together to develop the protocols, partnerships were formed at that table, not just the protocols. And so off they went. And so the process was significantly altered. But the science, the testing, and particularly that safety testing, was true to the way it's always done. That had to come first.
And Dave, maybe you can talk a little bit more about that. One of the other questions I've heard come up and that people are talking about is, it sounds like there was sort of a novel approach to developing the vaccine product itself, not the process, but the vaccine itself, that maybe is relatively new. And there might be some skepticism around that. Can you speak to that at all?
Yeah, well, it's funny you use the novel approach. It's a novel virus, right? Which means the world has never seen this virus before. And so that's part of the reality of what we're facing. So what you're really talking about is the development, and in this case now the application of very specific sort of genetic approaches to stopping a virus in its tracks. And so there are new genetic approaches that are part of some of these vaccines that have never been used before. But that's largely because the science for these didn't exist before. And so what has happened is the advance of science in the sort of the genetic world has met up with this great need, and the scientists have found a way to apply this science to this particular virus. I think what we'll see in the future is that particular approach being applied to all kinds of new vaccines and probably other therapeutics as we go forward.
Yeah, and actually on that point, I think I've actually heard some people suggest that this may be the end of worldwide pandemics because the science is able to respond to almost any type of virus because of this somewhat different or novel approach, even though the actual foundation of how it works is still the same, stimulating an immune response off of inactive or dead genetic material from the virus.
Yeah.
That hasn't changed, right?
Yeah, and you know the other thing that occurred here is if you think about it, once the federal government made the decision to take on the financial risk of the advancement of this cause, what happened was the pharmaceutical companies became more collaborative and less competitive than they've ever been. And I wouldn't go so far as to say they sort of treated it as open source information, but they certainly shared important breakthroughs along the path and didn't keep it in their own laboratories and keep it to themselves. They shared that because there was a worldwide pandemic going on, and it wasn't about the money, because the money was guaranteed for them, and the payoff would be public health across the world. And so it's almost an open source approach that led to this, and we're all familiar with that in the sort of tech world, and how that has advanced technology so well. It's sort of the first effort to do that, and the first application to do that in the pharmacy world.
Yeah. So I'm hearing some people, Dave, say, "I'm concerned. I don't want to be a guinea pig here. I don't want to be the one who takes this first and have this be tested on me when it's untested or unvalidated." What would you say to somebody who has some of those concerns based on what you've researched in your background?
Yeah. So in many ways, these vaccines probably had larger test samples than others in recent history. I mentioned earlier the Pfizer vaccine went to some 44,000 people. The group they're normally looking at is about 30,000. And we'll get into this in a future conversation. But when you look at who got the vaccine during the trials, they track that very, very closely in terms of demographics, age, communities they live in, even countries they live in, ethnicities, racial breakdowns. All of that's available and is important because those were part of the protocols that they agreed to up front. And those are the kinds of things that in the approval process, both the governmental approvals and then the outside agency bodies that have to approve it, those demographic testing demands have to be met as well. And so we'll get into that in a future episode. But I think one thing it would really be hard to say based on the data is that it wasn't tested properly. We could take issue with other things maybe in terms of, but when you just look at the numbers are pretty impressive in how quickly they tested a lot of people.
Yeah, I'm actually really glad you made that point, Dave, about the diversity of the test group, because we often don't see that in science necessarily, which I think also makes some people a little bit more skeptical when something new comes out. And especially with this virus, because it disproportionately affects communities of color
Right.
in a really negative way, it's nice to know that there was a purposeful approach to make sure there was a really diverse group of test subjects.
Yeah. So we'll get into that in our future conversation. I think that's probably enough on this for now. And again, to our staff out there, as we're opening this dialogue, we're just inviting you in, and maybe you learned something. Maybe you heard something that you didn't agree with or would want to know more about. That's exactly why we're having this conversation. We invite those questions, we invite that feedback, and again, other mechanisms within your ministry site in order to both raise those but keep the dialogue going. So we will be back in future videos to talk about other aspects of this and to keep the dialogue going. So until then, keep the dialogue open and your minds as well. And God bless. We'll see you again.